For 2 decades, a ruthless timber baron dumped thousands of tons of suffocating sawdust against a poor farmer's fence, choking his land and destroying his livelihood. The town laughed. The law looked away. But the farmer didn't get mad. He turned 20 years of illegal garbage into a multi-million-dollar empire. The Willamette Valley was known for its deep, fertile loam and endless stretches of green. But for Emmett Hayes, the land had become a dusty, acidic nightmare. Emmett was a third-generation farmer, a man whose hands were as calloused and weathered as the 1950s Ford tractor he kept running through sheer willpower. His 40-acre plot, passed down from his grandfather, was his entire world. It was small, but it produced enough corn and soybeans to keep him and his wife, Margaret, fed and out of debt. That all changed the day Harrison Caldwell bought the sprawling 400-acre parcel adjacent to Emmett's property. Harrison Caldwell was a man who wore custom-tailored suits to construction sites. He had inherited Caldwell timber from his father, but Harrison wasn't interested in sustainable forestry. He was interested in volume, efficiency, and crushing his competitors. Within 6 months of purchasing the neighboring land, Harrison erected a state-of-the-art lumber processing mill. The facility ran 24 hours a day, stripping, cutting, and planing thousands of logs. With massive production came massive waste, sawdust, mountains of it. Disposing of industrial sawdust legally required hauling it to a specialized biomass facility 3 counties over, a process that cost Caldwell Timber tens of thousands of dollars a month. Harrison Caldwell, entirely devoid of a moral compass, found a cheaper solution. He noticed that the eastern edge of his property, the side bordering Emmett Hayes's modest farm, was slightly elevated and hidden from the main highway by a thick line of Douglas firs. It started quietly on a Tuesday evening in late September. Emmett was on his back porch when he heard the heavy, grinding gears of a commercial dump truck backing up to his property line. He walked out to the barbed wire fence just in time to see a hydraulic bed lift dumping 5 tons of wet, steaming pine and oak dust directly against his fence line. The sheer weight of the pile snapped the wire and spilled 3 feet onto Emmett's soil. Emmett drove his pickup straight to the mill the next morning. He demanded to see Harrison, but was intercepted by a smirking foreman who told him it was a navigational error by a new driver. But the next night, 2 trucks arrived. By the end of the month, a fleet of dump trucks was backing up to Emmett's fence line every single evening, depositing hundreds of tons of pulverized wood waste. The environmental devastation was swift and brutal. Sawdust, especially from raw, uncured pine and oak, is highly acidic. As the autumn rains hit the Willamette Valley, the water percolated through the massive pile of wood waste, brewing a toxic, dark brown sludge high in tannins and acidic compounds. This runoff flowed directly down the elevation gradient into Emmett's fields. Within a year, the pH of Emmett's pristine topsoil plummeted. His corn turned a sickly, jaundiced yellow before withering entirely. His soybean roots burned in the ground. Emmett fought back the only way a lawful man knows how. He went to the authorities. He filed complaints with the county environmental board, the local sheriff, and the mayor's office. But Oak Haven was a company town, and Caldwell Timber was the company. Harrison Caldwell paid the salaries of half the town's voting population, sponsored the local high school football team, and made heavy, anonymous donations to the mayor's re-election campaigns. When the county inspector finally came out, he stood in front of a 20-foot-high wall of sawdust that was actively spilling onto Emmett's property, shrugged, and wrote in his report that the debris was wind-blown and impossible to trace definitively to Caldwell Timber. "You're a relic, Hayes," Harrison Caldwell told Emmett one afternoon at the local diner, leaning over Emmett's table, invading his space. "Your little dirt patch is in my way. Sell it to me for $1,000 an acre, and you can retire somewhere nice. Fight me and I'll bury you, literally." Emmett refused to sell, but Harrison made good on his threat. Years bled into decades. The dumping never stopped. What began as a pile became a ridge, and what became a ridge morphed into an apocalyptic 40-foot-high mountain of sawdust that spanned a full mile along Emmett's property line. It blocked the morning sun. In the dry summer months, the prevailing winds whipped toxic, microscopic wood particulates across the farm. Everything Emmett owned was perpetually coated in a fine, gritty film. The financial toll was catastrophic, but the human toll was worse. Margaret, who loved tending to her vegetable garden, developed severe asthma. The constant inhalation of wood dust scarred her lungs, leaving her reliant on expensive inhalers and steroids. Medical bills piled up faster than the sawdust. Emmett was forced to take out a second mortgage, then a third. He sold off his grandfather's tractor. He sold off 20 acres of his land, just to keep the bank from foreclosing on the house. By 2018, Emmett was 62 years old, broken in spirit and drowning in debt. The Sawdust Mountain was now a staggering 2 million cubic yards of waste. It was a monument to Caldwell's greed and Emmett's helplessness. One bleak November evening, the bank sent a final notice of foreclosure. Emmett sat at his kitchen table, staring at the paperwork, the rhythmic, mocking beep, beep, beep of Caldwell's dump trucks backing up in the distance, echoing in his ears. He was ready to give up. He reached for the phone to call Harrison Caldwell and accept whatever insulting pennies the man would offer. But a massive, unseasonal supercell thunderstorm rolled over the valley that night, changing the trajectory of Emmett's life forever. The storm battered Oak Haven with hurricane-force winds and torrential rain. The sheer volume of water overloaded the structural integrity of the 20-year-old Sawdust Mountain. Around 3 a.m., Emmett heard a sound like a localized earthquake. A massive landslide of wet, rotting wood waste had collapsed, crashing through what was left of the fence and spilling hundreds of tons of debris directly into Emmett's backyard. When dawn broke, Emmett walked out into the cold, crisp air to survey the damage. What he saw confused him. The landslide had sheared away the outer layers of the mountain, exposing the deep, ancient core of the pile, stuff that had been dumped back in the late 90s. Emmett expected to see dark, foul-smelling sludge. Instead, he saw thick, chalky white veins webbing through the dark, brown, organic matter. It looked like a massive subterranean root system. The air didn't smell like rotting wood. It smelled incredibly fresh, earthy, and sweet, like a forest floor after a spring rain. Curious and concerned that this white webbing might be some new toxic mold that would finally kill off his remaining trees, Emmett scooped a large sample into a heavy-duty plastic contractor bag. He drove 2 hours to the State Agricultural University and walked into the agronomy department, demanding someone tell him what kind of poison Caldwell had unleashed on his farm. He was directed to Dr. Franklin Lewis, a brilliant but eccentric mycologist who specialized in soil remediation. Dr. Lewis took the bag, dumped the contents onto a stainless steel lab table, and adjusted his glasses. He fell dead silent. "Mr. Hayes," Dr. Lewis whispered, picking up a chunk of the deep brown, crumbly substrate that was bound tightly together by the white webbing. "Where exactly did you get this?" "From the nightmare in my backyard," Emmett said bitterly. 20 years of oak and pine dust rotting under the rain. Dr. Lewis looked up, his eyes wide. "Mr. Hayes, this isn't poison. This is alchemy. Do you have any idea what happens to hardwood sawdust when it's compressed under thousands of tons of weight? Naturally pasteurized by its own internal heat and aged for 2 decades. Emmett shook his head. "It becomes the absolute perfect growing medium," Dr. Lewis explained, his voice trembling with academic excitement. "Raw sawdust is acidic and steals nitrogen from the soil, but this has been composting anaerobically for 20 years. The pH has perfectly neutralized, and this white webbing, it's mycelium." specifically aggressive wild strains of Pleurotus austriatus and Lentinula edodes. Oyster and shiitake mushrooms. The wind must have carried wild spores into the pile years ago, and they've been silently colonizing the deep, warm center of that mountain ever since. Dr. Lewis ran the soil through a series of rapid chemical tests in front of Emmett. This substrate is gold, Emmett. It is incredibly rich in humic acid and bioavailable nutrients. Commercial mushroom farms spend millions of dollars buying hardwood pellets, hydrating them, and sterilizing them in giant autoclaves to create what you have sitting naturally in your backyard by the millions of tons. Emmett stared at the dirt on the table. A spark, long dead, ignited in his chest. How much is it worth? If properly managed? Dr. Lewis smiled. You are sitting on a biological gold mine. Emmett drove home in a daze, his mind racing. For 20 years, Harrison Caldwell thought he was using Emmett's farm as a free garbage dump. In reality, Caldwell had been delivering millions of dollars worth of premium raw materials, stacking them up and allowing them to age to perfection, entirely free of charge. The revenge wouldn't be loud. It would be silent, surgical, and utterly devastating. Emmett didn't call the bank to surrender. Instead, he called a high-risk private lender in Portland and leveraged the absolute last drop of equity he had in his house to secure a $50,000 loan. Margaret thought he had lost his mind, but when Emmett explained the science and the poetry of the revenge, she gripped his hand and told him to burn Caldwell to the ground. Under the cover of night, Emmett and Margaret went to work. They couldn't let Caldwell see what they were doing, so Emmett erected a series of long, opaque agricultural hoop houses just behind the tree line, out of sight from the mill's security cameras. Emmett rented a compact front-end loader. Every night while Caldwell's trucks dumped fresh, raw sawdust on the top of the mountain, Emmett was at the bottom of the avalanche zone, quietly scooping out tons of the rich, 20-year-old mycelium-colonized gold. He moved the substrate into the climate-controlled hoop houses, working with Dr. Lewis, who signed on as a silent consultant. Emmett introduced premium commercial spores of king oyster, lion's mane, and maytake mushrooms into the pre-colonized substrate. Because the wood waste was already perfectly broken down and rich in complex carbohydrates, the commercial fungi exploded in growth. Within 6 weeks, Emmett walked into his first hoop house and wept. The shelves were overflowing with massive, pristine clusters of gourmet mushrooms. The king oysters had stalks as thick as a man's wrist. The lion's mane cascaded down like beautiful white waterfalls. It was a flawless, chemical-free, organic crop, grown entirely on the waste of his enemy. Emmett packed his first harvest into unmarked, refrigerated crates and drove to Seattle. He didn't waste time at farmers' markets. He went straight to the loading docks of Michelin-starred restaurants and elite organic food distributors. When the head chefs saw the size, texture, and flavor profile of Emmett's mushrooms, they were stunned. "Where are you getting the substrate for these?" one renowned chef asked, inspecting a massive maytake cluster. "The flavor profile is incredibly complex. It tastes like ancient forest soil." "It's a family secret," Emmett replied with a sly smile. He secured exclusive contracts on the spot. By the end of his first week in business, Emmett Hayes had quietly banked $12,000 in cash. But the mushrooms were only the beginning. Emmett realized that the top layers of the mountain, the newer, drier sawdust that hadn't composted yet, was perfectly suited for something else. Biochar. He used a portion of his mushroom profits to secretly purchase a commercial-grade pyrolysis retort, a specialized kiln that burns organic material in a low-oxygen environment. He began feeding the dry sawdust into the retort, converting Caldwell's raw waste into high-carbon biochar. He then blended this biochar with the leftover spent mushroom substrate, creating an ultra-premium, biologically active soil amendment. He bagged it under a newly formed shell company, Apex Soil Solutions, and marketed it to the high-end organic vineyards popping up across the Pacific Northwest. The vineyards, desperate for organic carbon to retain water and boost soil microbiology, bought it by the pallet load at $50 a bag. By the end of 2019, Emmett's farm was grossing over $80,000 a month. He paid off the private loan. He paid off his mortgages. He bought Margaret the best medical care money could buy, and her breathing improved drastically. And the sweetest, the most intoxicating part of it all? Harrison Caldwell was still paying his truckers' union wages to deliver the raw materials directly to Emmett's property line every single night, completely oblivious to the empire being built in the shadows. Every evening when the dump trucks beeped and the fresh load of sawdust cascaded down the mountain, Emmett Hayes would stand on his back porch, sip his coffee, and whisper into the wind, "Thank you for the delivery, Harrison." While Emmett Hayes silently built an empire in the shadows of the Sawdust Mountain, Harrison Caldwell was slowly losing his grip on reality. The year 2021 brought unprecedented turbulence to the global lumber market. Supply chain disruptions, wild fluctuations in building material costs, and aggressive new state environmental regulations squeezed Caldwell Timber's profit margins to razor-thin levels. For the first time in his pampered life, Harrison was bleeding money. Desperate to maintain his lavish lifestyle and keep his shareholders satisfied, he began cutting corners with reckless abandon, pushing his aging mill machinery past safe operational limits and ignoring fundamental safety protocols. However, Harrison's greatest vulnerability was his sloppy bookkeeping regarding waste management. In late 2022, the State Environmental Protection Agency launched a massive, unannounced audit of the region's top industrial polluters. Inspector Bradley Donovan, a relentless auditor known for dismantling corrupt corporate structures, was assigned to Caldwell Timber. Donovan spent weeks poring over Harrison's production logs, cross-referencing the millions of board feet of lumber processed against the facility's waste disposal receipts. The math simply did not add up. According to the state's calculations, Caldwell Timber had generated nearly 3 million cubic yards of sawdust over the past 2 decades that simply did not exist on paper. There were no biomass facility transfer receipts. There were no hauling invoices. "Where is the byproduct, Mr. Caldwell?" Inspector Donovan asked coldly during a tense meeting in Harrison's mahogany-paneled office. "You have decades of missing industrial waste. If you cannot produce disposal manifests, the agency will assume illegal dumping, and the fines will be calculated per ton, per day, dating back to your first year of operation." Panic set in. Harrison knew that paying 2 decades' worth of retroactive environmental fines would instantly bankrupt him. He needed an out. He needed a scapegoat. "I didn't dump it," Harrison lied smoothly, his mind racing. "I've been storing it. It's an experimental organic composting initiative on the eastern perimeter of the property. I have an arrangement with the neighboring farm." Donovan demanded to see this supposed initiative immediately. Harrison led the inspector out to his luxury SUV, intending to show him the massive, rotting pile on Emmett's fence line and claim it was a mutual agricultural experiment. He expected to see the same pathetic, dust-choked farm he had mocked for years. He expected to see Emmett Hayes broken and destitute. Instead, as Harrison's vehicle rounded the dense line of Douglas firs, he slammed on the brakes. The SUV skidded to a violent halt on the gravel road. Harrison's jaw dropped in absolute disbelief. Emmett's farm was unrecognizable. The dilapidated wooden fences had been replaced by high-end, electrified security gates. Beyond the gates stood a sprawling, immaculate campus of 12 massive, climate-controlled, commercial hoop houses, their exhaust fans humming with quiet, efficient power. A fleet of pristine, refrigerated delivery trucks bearing the sleek logo Apex Biofungi and Soils was lined up at a newly constructed loading dock. Workers in clean uniforms were operating heavy machinery, efficiently loading pallets of premium soil amendments and crates of gourmet mushrooms. But the most shocking revelation was the mountain itself. it was shrinking. Emmett's operation had systematically excavated the entire lower southern face of the Sawdust Ridge. The deep, dark, mycelium-rich core of the waste was exposed, actively being harvested by front-end loaders. Harrison watched, paralyzed with shock, as Emmett Hayes, wearing a tailored canvas work jacket and looking healthier and more commanding than he had in 20 years, supervised the loading of another massive shipment. Inspector Donovan whistled softly, entirely impressed. "Well, Mr. Caldwell, I have to admit, this is an incredibly sophisticated bioremediation operation. I had no idea your company possessed the foresight to convert raw timber waste into high-yield agricultural organics. This is a multi-million-dollar setup." Harrison's face turned the color of wet ash. He wasn't entirely sure what he was looking at, but he understood one undeniable fact. The dirt-poor farmer he had ruthlessly tortured and tried to bury alive had somehow turned his garbage into a massive fortune. The rage that boiled up inside Harrison was blinding. He didn't see the poetic justice. He only saw stolen money. He saw his money. Within 48 hours, Harrison hired Gregory Mitchell, the most vicious and expensive corporate litigator in Portland. Mitchell drafted a brutal lawsuit against Emmett Hayes, demanding an immediate cease and desist, the total seizure of apex biofungi and soils, and a staggering $15 million in retroactive profit restitution. The legal premise was audaciously greedy. Mitchell argued that because the sawdust originated from Caldwell Timber's logs, it remained the sole intellectual and physical property of Harrison Caldwell. Therefore, Emmett was actively committing grand larceny by stealing Caldwell's valuable industrial byproducts and profiting from them without authorization or compensation. When the sheriff served Emmett with the massive stack of legal papers, Margaret wept, terrified that the nightmare of Caldwell Timber was finally going to swallow them whole. But Emmett did not panic. He calmly brewed a pot of coffee, sat down at his kitchen table, and read every single page of the lawsuit. A slow, dangerous smile crept across his weathered face. Harrison Caldwell, in his blinding greed, had just walked right into the most lethal legal trap imaginable. Emmett picked up the phone and dialed Diane Foster, a brilliant, cutthroat environmental defense attorney who had a personal vendetta against corporate bullies. When Emmett explained the nature of the lawsuit and the history of the mountain, Diane laughed so hard she had to put the phone on speaker. "Emmett," Diane said, her voice sharp with predatory glee, "do not worry about a thing. Harrison Caldwell just handed us the match to burn his entire empire to the ground." The courtroom was packed to capacity. The sheer audacity of the case, a billionaire timber baron suing a local farmer for stealing sawdust, had attracted regional news outlets, environmental activists, and local politicians. Judge Victoria Barnes, a no-nonsense magistrate with a deep understanding of property law, presided over the bench. Harrison Caldwell sat at the plaintiff's table, wearing a crisp charcoal suit, projecting supreme confidence. His lawyer, Gregory Mitchell, spent the entire morning laying out a seemingly bulletproof narrative. He presented production manifests, drone photography of the mountain, and financial records subpoenaed from Emmett's company. Mitchell painted Harrison as a visionary businessman whose valuable raw materials had been systematically plundered by an opportunistic, deceitful farmer. "Your Honor," Mitchell concluded, pacing dramatically before the judge, "this is not a complicated issue. The material in question came directly from Caldwell Timber. Mr. Hayes took this material, processed it, and built a massive enterprise on the back of my client's property. We demand full restitution for 20 years of stolen profits." When it was the defense's turn, Diane Foster stood up. She did not bring a massive stack of papers. She simply walked to the center of the courtroom, adjusted her glasses, and turned her attention directly to Harrison Caldwell. "The defense calls Mr. Harrison Caldwell to the stand," Diane announced. Harrison confidently strode to the witness box, swearing to tell the truth. He looked down at Diane with a familiar, arrogant smirk. "Mr. Caldwell," Diane began, her tone dangerously soft. Your entire lawsuit hinges on the absolute assertion that the 2 million cubic yards of sawdust located on the property line is your exclusive rightful property. Is that correct? Yes, Harrison stated firmly. Every flake of it. And you have claimed ownership of this material continuously for the past 20 years. Of course. It is an asset of Caldwell Timber. Diane nodded slowly. She walked over to the evidence table and picked up a thick, bound document bearing the official seal of the Environmental Protection Agency. Mr. Caldwell, Diane said, her voice rising in volume, under Oregon State Environmental Code, Section 402, an entity that maintains ownership of industrial wood waste must properly stored in a lined, chemically treated, and legally permitted containment facility. Failure to do so constitutes active, illegal toxic dumping. Harrison's smirk instantly vanished. A cold sweat broke out across his neck. His lawyer, Mitchell, suddenly sat up straight, realizing the catastrophic error they had made. "Objection!" Mitchell shouted, leaping to his feet. "Relevance!" "Overruled!" Judge Barnes snapped, leaning forward, her eyes locked on Harrison. "I am very interested to see where Counselor Foster is going with this. Proceed." "Thank you, Your Honor," Diane continued, stepping right up to the witness box. "Mr. Caldwell, if you claim this sawdust was abandoned garbage, then under the law of finders and salvage, it belongs to Mr. Hayes the moment it crossed his property line. He is free to profit from it. However, if you claim this sawdust is your highly valuable property, as you just swore under oath, then you are admitting to operating an unpermitted, illegal toxic waste dump for 2 decades, actively leaching acidic runoff into a civilian's groundwater." The courtroom fell dead silent. The trap had closed. The steel jaws were clamped tight around Harrison's throat. Diane turned to face the judge. "Your Honor, Inspector Bradley Donovan from the EPA is sitting in the gallery today. He has informed my office that if Mr. Caldwell maintains ownership of this waste, the federal and state fines for 20 years of unpermitted toxic storage will exceed $25 million. Furthermore, Mr. Caldwell will be personally liable for criminal negligence." Diane turned back to Harrison, delivering the final, crushing blow. "So, Mr. Caldwell, I ask you one last time under penalty of perjury. Is that mountain of sawdust yours? Or is it Emmett Hayes's?" Harrison was completely trapped. If he claimed the sawdust to win his $15 million lawsuit, he would instantly be hit with $25 million in EPA fines and face potential prison time for illegal dumping. If he admitted he abandoned it as garbage, he lost the lawsuit, and Emmett kept everything. He was paralyzed. He looked at his lawyer, but Mitchell just stared at his legal pad, completely defeated. It's not mine," Harrison choked out, his voice a pathetic, trembling whisper. "It was abandoned waste." The gallery erupted. Judge Barnes slammed her gavel down aggressively. "Order! Order in this court." Once the room quieted, the judge glared at Harrison with absolute disgust. "Mr. Caldwell, this lawsuit is a malicious, frivolous abuse of the judicial system. Case dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, I am awarding the defense full coverage of all legal fees to be paid by Caldwell Timber immediately." The fallout was apocalyptic for Harrison. The public humiliation shattered Caldwell Timber's already fragile stock price. The shareholders panicked and forced Harrison out as CEO, without his extravagant salary and drowning in debt from his failed legal crusade and subsequent environmental audits. Harrison Caldwell was forced to declare personal bankruptcy. The bank seized his custom suits, his luxury vehicles, and his sprawling estate. Within a year, Caldwell Timber went into receivership. The massive, polluting mill was shut down, and the physical assets were placed on the auction block. Emmett Hayes attended the auction in person, using the massive profits generated from Apex biofungi and soils. Emmett placed the single highest bid. He purchased the entirety of Caldwell Timber, including the mill and all 400 acres of surrounding land, for pennies on the dollar. He didn't buy the mill to run it, he bought it to dismantle it. Emmett tore down the colossal metal processing buildings and sold the machinery for scrap. He hired a crew to rip up the concrete foundations, exposing the deep, compacted earth underneath to the sun for the first time in decades. He then took his premium, bioactive soil amendments, the very compost born from Caldwell's arrogance, and spread it thickly across the scarred industrial land. He planted thousands of native oak, pine, and cedar saplings, transforming a site of toxic greed into a sprawling, protected nature reserve. He named it the Margaret Hayes Forestry Trust, dedicating it to his wife, who now breathed easy in the crisp, clean air of their massive, thriving estate. On a quiet Tuesday evening, exactly 23 years after the first dump truck had backed up to his fence, Emmett Hayes stood on the porch of his newly renovated farmhouse. He looked out over his sprawling, multi-million-dollar mushroom empire and then shifted his gaze toward the endless sea of vibrant, green saplings blowing gently in the Willamette Valley wind. He had taken 20 years of absolute disrespect, 20 years of choking dust and bitter hardship, and he had forged it into a living, breathing kingdom. He had weaponized patience. He had monetized his enemy's garbage. And in the end, the poor farmer didn't just beat the timber baron, he completely erased him from the landscape. If Emmett's incredible revenge story inspired you, don't let this journey end here. Hit that like button to support true stories of triumph. Share this incredible tale with anyone who loves seeing a bully get exactly what they deserve. And subscribe to our channel for more jaw-dropping real-life farming dramas. Have you ever turned a massive setback into an unbelievable success? Drop a comment below and let us know your story. We read every single one.